Well, I mean, I also don't want to write something that feels like an after-school special.
Yeah.
Because I remember, do you remember getting those, they wheel the VCR into the classroom, they're like, we're going to watch this great movie with that stilted acting, and they're like, no, I don't like a drug.
It's the Liars Club Podcast, a weekly conversation filled with insights, tips, and secrets from the myriad of creative people who make stuff up for a living. Stay tuned and you could hear from New York Times bestselling authors, National Book Award finalists, debut novelists, screenwriters, musicians, composers, cartoonists, actors, stand-up comedians, line tamers, and all manner of creators who burn the midnight oil and sometimes their dinner. Whether you're a reader or a fellow writer, join us as we plumb the depths of the creative process for inspiration, semi-plausible stories, and a few laughs. So grab a libation, sit back, and spend some quality time with the creative folks who make stuff up for a living in a lively conversation with the Liars Club.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
All right,
Hello.
McGoran, put your pants on.
Oh, God. Is that what that was? I'm blind.
Hey, Mark.
Mark, how are you?
Hello. Good afternoon.
You throw you right into the confusion and turmoil and mayhem, but
And
course.
McGoran without pants.
it'll all make
exactly.
sense soon.
Maybe not.
How are you, man?
I'm good.
Good.
Very warm, but enjoying the summer.
Yes.
How are all of you?
We're fine. We're sweltering in about 97-degree heat here in Pennsylvania.
New
But other than
Jersey.
that,
Yeah.
all's well.
We don't even know what state we're in, okay?
That's how hot it is.
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
how hot it
That's
is.
right.
That's right.
What state of
Mass
matter?
hallucination.
I was solid,
Exactly.
but I think I'm part
Yeah.
of the liquid now.
Yeah.
All right,
Thing
rabble.
about having no pants on, right?
All right,
Yeah.
rabble.
He meant it
Quiet.
that way.
Okay.
Quiet, rabble.
Rabble.
Rabble, thank you. All right, so Mark, you're allowed to talk now, so I can check your levels.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark. It says it's 93 outside, but then my weather app says it feels like 104.
Whoa.
So I am also composed entirely of liquid.
Okay.
It's fine. It's a great state to be in.
Indeed. All right, you sound very good, actually. So this is a good
Good.
connection.
Fantastic.
So here we go, ladies and gentlemen, once again with the Liars Club Oddcast. After what seems to be a long period of time not being together, and suddenly we're chaotically together, which is great fun. And poor Mark has been brought into this mess. So I'm going to introduce myself and end with John McGoran, who's going to introduce Mark for us. My name is Keith Strunk.
Mary Jones.
Kelly Simmons.
Gregory Frost.
And I am John McGoran, and we are very, very excited to have on the show today Mark Oshiro, who is the Hugo finalist creator of the online Mark Does Stuff universe, which includes Mark Reads and Mark Watches. He's nonfiction editor of Queers Destroy Science Fiction from Lightspeed Magazine, co-editor of Speculative Fiction 2015, and author of the highly acclaimed novel Anger is a Gift, a YA contemporary about queer friendship, love, and police brutality, which won the Schneider Family Book Award, was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award, or LAMI. As Mark says on their website, when they are not writing, crying on camera about fictional characters, or ruining lives at conventions, Mark is busy trying to fulfill their lifelong goal to pet every dog in the world. Mark Oshiro, welcome to the Oddcast.
I wish I had one of those really annoying air horns to just blow right now. But then I have to blow it directly into my ear. I will also have you know, since this morning, I have pet 6 dogs.
Keith is petting my dog right now.
Oh, I'm very jealous.
Yeah, it's a very sweet little dog, too.
No, I don't know about that.
It's a good thing you didn't do the air horn, though, or people will think this is a hockey podcast.
So that's a
You know-
that's a good 6 dogs in the morning. That's
Yeah.
that's
It
pretty
really
Well,
is.
because you're way earlier than we
Yeah.
are, so it's pretty
Yeah,
early there.
3-dog night, 6-dog morning, you know.
Mark
Exactly.
Oshiro
See?
pets
You
more dogs
understand.
by noon than most people pet all day.
It's true. It's
Well, we can-
absolutely true.
We'll see if we can get an air horn or in post.
Or maybe some barking.
I can do an air horn
Or both.
minutes.
Or both.
So,
We
so I
can
think,
get a barking air horn.
oh wow. Well, so what the question that I just had was, it seems safe to say that you're not afraid of controversy, but I just wanted to ask if you think you've gone too far with your pro dog petting stance.
Never. It's not far enough. I mean, it's so well known at this point that people, when I do events, will bring their animals and just take photos of me petting them. So I feel
here's the
like
deal.
I win in that.
You just walk up to strange dogs and pet them? Can they
No,
be
I
any-
always ask. I always ask because I think it's fair. Because some dogs are not actually cool with humans,
No.
and like they're not ready for that socialization. So you always ask. It is always the case. But honestly, like I have this thing where I do this thing with my face where I just kind of look at the dog and then I look at the owner, and oftentimes the owner's like, "You can pet them," and I'm like, "Yeah, hell yeah."
So do you
It's
have
okay.
a favorite breed, or are you a non-discriminating dog
I
petter?
I'm generally non-discriminating, but I grew up with big dogs, so Rottweilers, Pit Bulls, German Shepherds. I like a dog that I can wrestle with, that was like can jump on me and lay me flat on the ground. Like I just have a thing for like the bigger dogs, but I will always pet any dog that is eager to let me pet them.
So is it? Do you see like an expansion of
dog
the
might be
universe,
licked
Mark pet stuff?
I would not be opposed to that.
Yeah,
That is not a terrible
we'll talk
idea.
after.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Brandon.
Okay.
So
strange.
so long before Anger is a Gift,
Yeah.
you achieved great success with Mark Does Stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about that and where you got the idea for it and how you got it started?
I want you to also know how strange it is to talk about it, because I think we're in a world now where, because we have things like Twitch and streaming or whatnot, like explaining that you are streaming or recording yourself while doing things it makes a lot of sense and people get it. But when I started doing this, next month is the 10-year anniversary of Mark Does Stuff.
That's wild.
When I first started doing it and I would explain it to people, they'd be like, "So you record yourself while, is it porn? Is it an adult thing?" And I was like, no. There's not.
Depends on how you define that, I suppose.
Well, I mean, that's very true. But so it's been this very surreal journey. The origin story is that I got asked to cover the Twilight New Moon panel at Comic-Con when I was writing for a music and pop culture website in LA. And I decided not to cover the panel and instead cover, that was the first year people started camping out at Comic-Con in order to get into Hall H. And I ended up doing a story on the people who camped there. And because of that, I had a very interesting conversation with my editor, who just was like, what would be interesting one day is if you wrote about Twilight and you read these books that a lot of us have not read that are very popular. Just tell us what's in them. And I was like, that's a terrible idea. I don't have time for that. And so this blog I started a few days later as a joke for my office mates got found by the rest of the internet. And I haven't stopped for 10 years.
And that, I assume, is Mark Reed's, right?
Yeah, so Mark Reed's is 10 years old as of, I think, August 9th. This is not what I planned to do with my life, but it was one of those things that was a small hobby that then ballooned into this beautiful, bizarre nightmare that I love, and I'm still doing. It's great. It's amazing.
Well, I mean,
Well, the fact-
in all fairness, Mark, do you think that running a podcast is what we thought we were going to do?
And we're still trying to get out of town.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our unballooned
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah.
Well, sometime life hands you lemons, so you record yourself talking about it. Like,
And
that's just how it works.
And speaking of lemons, let's go back to Twilight for a second. Now that you explained that started out as a Comic-Con thing, I sort of understand the fantasy science fiction aspects of it, because one of my questions was, what made you choose Harry Potter and all this other science fictional material as your source?
So I grew up more on the science fiction horror side in terms of speculative fiction. I didn't read a whole lot of fantasy. I grew up with the kind of fantasy nerds who were very, very much into gatekeeping, who were angry that I didn't know every word of the Silmarillion already, which is not how
No,
knowledge.
they exist.
Like,
I know they're real.
Yeah, it'd be that thing where someone's, I'd be like, "Hey, what books are you reading? And what's this thing?" And they're like, "Oh, well, you haven't read the Silmarillion. You don't know what's it." I'm like, "That's how knowledge works. You don't know a thing until you read the thing." And so I was very off-put by fantasy as a kid.
Yeah.
And so after I had the fourth of the Twilight books for Mark Reed, and I had an ops mate, my friend Bree, who I'm still friends with, and she was like, "I would like to see you do this again. This was really fun, but I think it would be fun to watch you do this for something you ultimately like a whole lot. She's like, it's cool for you to yell at something you don't like, but like, you should try this again." And her suggestion was, you should read Harry Potter. And I still remember being like, I don't do wizards and shit. I don't do that. That's not my thing. Because in my head, Harry Potter was like high fantasy and so complex and like just, really, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like very condescending and just like not a thing. And I'm glad I was wrong. So I showed up at work and the paperback box set was on my desk the next day. And I was like, well, shit. Okay, they're here. I guess I'll try them. And so the same thing, even though I had like a decent, small, but like a decent following with the Twilight stuff, I was like, no one's going to read these things. And so I started reading I started reading Harry Potter, and I really tried to dislike it. I was like, I'm not into this. What is this series? Who cares about a boy wizard? And then Hagrid showed up, and I was like, oh, he's wearing a leather jacket. He's got a big beard. He descended out of the sky in a motor. Is he a leather daddy? Oh, I'm sorry.
Certainly one interpretation.
We bring our own material to everything that we read.
And now you're leaping into Discworld. Is that correct? That's the next direction?
I actually yesterday started my 38th Discworld book.
Wow.
So I think I have 3 or 4 left, which is very surreal because I started reading those books in 2014. So it's going to comprise 6 years of my life has been reading Terry Pratchett. So, and I've read so many things in between that too.
Yeah. But that's a good 6 years of your life, Terry Pratchett.
He's fantastic.
Wonderful.
It is amazing. I explain this to people because they're like, why do you still do it? And I'm like, it's been really cool to read authors and watch them get better and better at their craft and better at storytelling. And that's been one of the most rewarding experiences of reading Terry Pratchett's book in publication order, is to see him just get better and better. So it's great. Like, who could ask for a career that's like, when you really break it down, I sit around and read books and watch TV for a living. Like, that's pretty great.
That's pretty awesome.
We want that job.
So when and what did you first start writing? I mean, were you writing fiction the whole time? Yeah.
Yeah. I've been much more vocal about my origin story because now it's funny, but for many years I was very embarrassed by it. But I was writing when I was in elementary school. I won a short story contest when I was in first grade, and at the time I was living in Boise, Idaho. My story was hung in the Capitol building, and I was very proud of this. But I used to do this thing. So I was of the age where the Goosebumps books came out in real time when I was a kid, and I'm a huge horror fan, and I devoured those books. And we'd get the Scholastic Book Fair thing every month, and I would order the newest Goose. It was amazing. And so I decided I was going to write my own form of the Goosebumps books, and I called them Terrifying Tales. And what I didn't tell all the kids is that they were just Twilight Zone episodes with all the names changed.
And then be like,
trust me, you're not the first who's done that, okay?
Right? But I didn't, in my head, I wasn't thinking like, oh, this is fan fiction, or I'm learning what story, how to structure a story or how to write a twist. In my head, I was like, this is cool. This is what I want to be like. I want to write things that unnerve people and disturb people. So I started with that, and then started actually writing original fiction as a teenager. I wrote my first book when I was 21 years old. It's always been there. My path to being a published author has just been very strange, but I'm glad I went through things in this order, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you were nominated for a Hugo in the Best Fan category.
Yeah.
As a creator as well, were you ever conflicted in being honored as a fan when you have your own writing that you're working on?
No, because I'd been a fan of so many things for so long. I grew up with The Twilight Zone and X-Files and Star Wars, and I knew how important it was for me, especially once I had access to the internet very early on, like 12 or 13 years old, and finding these vibrant communities online of people who love the same things that I did. And so for me, the Hugo nomination, it was sort of like, oh, here's all these people I love and respect, and I love what they built. And it was like this welcome invitation to their club. Mm-hmm. That's how I viewed it. It's like, wow, these people I respect so much.
They love you back.
Yeah, it felt, it's always felt like this big family. So I was working on original fiction at the time, but for me, I always treated the nonfiction, the literary criticism with the same amount of attention and the same amount of love and respect. So for me, I don't write those things with it might use a different muscle in my brain, but I treat it exactly the same way.
And so you said Star Wars and Twilight Zone and Star Trek were inspirational for you. And all of those seem to have a social commentary running through them. Do you find yourself writing with a message or just telling a story, or both, or either, or neither?
I mean, I think the things that I enjoyed that had a message always had a good story too. They always had great characterization. If it was in the visual medium, the acting was incredible. The score, I liked all of the pieces that contributed to it. So I rarely have a message in mind when I start a story. For me, it's images, it's ideas. It might be something I'm wrestling with, but my always concern first is, is this a good plot? Is this a good story? Do these characters resonate? And then any of the meanings that I intend or end up there in the end are always secondary. I really care about characters and story, and I want those things to be obvious that I care about those things first. And then if something else is in there, like, that's fantastic and wonderful. But no, I usually go story first. Themes, any social messages are always secondary.
Yeah, that's great. And as important as the themes are, no one's going to get to them if the story isn't any good.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I also don't want to write something that feels like an after-school special.
Yeah.
Because I remember, do you remember getting those, they wheel the VCR into the classroom, they're like, we're going to watch this great movie, and 5 minutes with that stilted acting, and they're like, no, I don't like a drug. And as a kid, you're just like, all I'm being is condescended to.
Yeah.
None of this is actually realistic, and none of it feels real. It's not resonating. So I never want to write something that feels like that.
And yet,
I remember being a kid.
Like that.
You're out. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, done well. So I know you spent several years working on Anger is a Gift, and then of course, one has to wait the seemingly interminable traditional publishing pipeline, for the work to get through. And it seems that in that time, the themes that you focus on in the book, which were already obviously incredibly relevant, but it seems like the world kind of leaned into them a little bit while the book was being written and wending its way towards publication. How was that? Watching that happen? Yeah, it's
a surreal thing, particularly when you mean something as a fictional work. And knowing that even though I was drawing from reality, I still intended very much. Well, so I don't know if you know about this part of it, was that Anger is a Gift started as a science fiction book.
Yeah.
Huh.
And particularly, I was writing in the science fiction, dystopian fiction space. I loved this idea. The original intent of it is I wanted to write a trilogy where the end of the trilogy was the beginning of a dystopian world. And I loved the weirdness of the idea of who would notice a dystopian world forming. So even though that stuff got stripped out and I ended up taking the story in a different direction, there's still that thread of it in there, which is, why do these kids notice what's going wrong in their community before everyone else, and why does it take other people so long? And so then the weird thing is that the book got bought in early 2017, and by the time it came out in late spring of 2018, there were at least 2 parts of it that came true. And that was weird. Well, especially because then I'd read reviews like, oh, it's clear Mark is commenting on this event, and I was like,
no.
I just have the uncanny ability to tell the future, but only terrible things. My editor is like, can you write us winning the lottery in your 3rd book? That'd be great. Please do that. That would be awesome. I think it's more that history is cyclical, and there are so many things. I'm commenting on things that I went through as a teenager and getting to observe this sort of environment from my high school. And it's not that I necessarily predicted the future. It's that when we don't care about certain things as a society and we let things slide, we tend to fall back into familiar patterns. It's always going to be weird. It's not like I wrote a happy book where everything is perfect and is a perfect fantasy world. And wouldn't it be great if that came true, with my million dogs to pet a single day?
Yes, too many dogs to pet. So I was curious about that. I wrote a book in the 90s called The Pure Cold Light, and I have my students in a high school. The high school is the Eastern State Penitentiary here in Philadelphia, but it's been transformed into a high school. And so your whole thing about students in a school system where they feel like they're prisoners because of the way they're treated, I thought, man, he's dead on. That's exactly the perspective I had on inner city high school even then. Is there's very little difference between prisons and schools. That was magnificent.
And it was interesting. It's been interesting touring off of the book and doing not just book events, but I've been doing a lot of school visits, where, bless educators these days who are now adding books to curriculums that have come out in the last few years. And so I'm doing these school visits with kids who, many of them, if I'm in this sort of school environment, they're in the same school environment, 10 pages in, they're like, oh, I know exactly what this is. This is incredible. But I actually find it more interesting. I find often that when I am in more rural or suburban schools, the interaction that the students have with it, sometimes they think it's science fiction. And then we have to have the uncomfortable conversation of, oh, this is all actually drawn from the real world. But the thing that's striking then is it's a glimpse for a lot of them. They get to see a world that they don't understand, but they want to understand it. And they're like, I want to know what this experience is like. And your book allowed, it's like Radim Sims Bishop has the whole theory of, mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors.
Right.
And for a lot of these students, they read it and they're like, this is my chance to see another experience and learn what it's like. And I find that really rewarding. It's not necessarily something I intended or thought about when I was writing the book, but it's, I made the joke earlier, we all bring our own experiences to the things we read and the things we watch. And I love seeing people interpret it in ways I never intended. Like, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure it must be really compelling, going to some schools and having these kids, say, finally I see myself in a book.
Yeah.
And then you go to these other schools and it's like, how'd you make this up?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. That's really powerful.
Really
so I wanted to get back to, because you'd mentioned earlier about how this book started out as science fiction, because I was struck, looking at your primary focus on Mark Does Stuff, which does seem to be, very focused on kind of genre, very, science fiction and horror and some fantasy. And I wanted to ask you why you wrote kind of contemporary realism, since it seemed that genre was your focus. So how did that happen? What was that conversation like, and what was the process like of kind of contemporary realismification of the book?
It involved a lot of laying prone on the couch, not breathing off like a week. So
a little sobbing, maybe.
Oh, it wasn't a little. Not a little. So that came about in the summer of 2016. I was still in the trenches querying agents. I had been rejected over 30 times at that point. And something wasn't landing. It wasn't sticking. This was not getting the attention that I wanted. And I got feedback from an agent who gave me basically a rewrite and resubmit, saying, I love the voice of this main character. I love the focus of it being in a school. I love who you chose to be the voice of the story. There are so few books you have to understand, this was in 2016. At that point, we had How It Went Down by Kekel Magoon, All American Boys by Brendan Kiley and Jason Reynolds. There were very few books, at least in the public consciousness, that were dealing with violence in schools and police brutality. So this agent was like, we need this. This is something that people aren't talking about on the level you are. You also wrote the start of a science fiction trilogy where you're talking about weaponization and you're doing how technology can go wrong in the hands of the wrong people. So you wrote 2 books. You have shoved both of these books into the same book. I would like you to write 1 book and send me only 1 book. So either do it contemporary, lean into the voice and the setting, or only do the science fiction. Have fun. I mean, he didn't write that.
Yeah, but smart advice. Smart advice.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's that thing where sometimes you get feedback that is so brilliant that you lay prone on the couch and you don't breathe oxygen for a week. Like, that is not an easy fix. That's not something where you're like, it'll take an hour. And so I had to I sat with it for a week and I didn't do anything. Yeah. I didn't query another agent. I didn't open the manuscript. And so what I decided to do, I'm very big on outlining. I love outlining my stories and just getting a sense for what the major beats are in anything that I write.
God bless you on that.
Look, I was very much a pantser when I was in my teenage years and my early 20s. I would just write.
That's what the teen years are for.
Yeah, you could do that. I didn't have much success. And I think part of it was I needed the organization and I needed to think through the structure of a story. And so, coming from Mark Reads and Mark Watches, where I pick apart structure on a very granular level, when I decided to get back into really heavily writing fiction, I was like, I'm going to be a little more organized about this. So I had my major outline for just that book in the series. I'm like, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write 1 outline for a contemporary story. And then I'll write 1 science fiction one. And I'll know in my heart which of these stories is the right one. So I took 3 days, rewrote the story as contemporary, and I'm letting you all know I never wrote that science fiction outline.
Wow.
He was 100%. I figured out, in fact, the entire last third of the book in like a feverish hour and was like, wait, what if I end the book this way? And almost none of that has ever been edited at all. My editor was like, you nailed it. This is the ending.
Can I ask you who that was that recommended this?
That is my current agent. His name is Dongwon Song. I ended up signing with him about 7 or 8 months later. And part of it was his instinct. He knew there was too much. And I mean, that's a very common thing for people's first novels. They try to put everything they love into one book.
Yeah.
I think the thing that was really striking about the feedback that I got was something I hadn't thought of, and now I think of with every project, which is how do you focus a story? Who's telling the story? And then what are the borders? Like, if you think of it like a portrait. And one of the things I really liked about his advice was he was like, your story needs a frame. And that's what's missing is you now are trying to tell everything. And instead, you know, it used to be multi-POV. I had the story that was going to be 3 books. And instead he's like, just one. Why can't it just be one about one person? And so, you know, it was in January of 2017. We were at a convention together, and through a weird series of events, I had interest from an editor at one of the big 5. And so we resumed our conversation. He read the book on his flight home from that convention, and we talked, and a day later he offered representation, and it has been a very surreal journey since then. But I mean, that's the thing. It's so rare to find someone who gets story on that level and can give really difficult feedback, but knows that feedback is important.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Do you think that from reading all of those really complex, deep books like Harry Potter, I mean, like that is a sprawling ass book. Do you think that it invaded your head a little bit and made you want to sprawl?
I think that came earlier. I mean, I'm obsessed with the trilogy because of Star Wars.
I see.
I'm obsessed with it as a form of storytelling.
Gotcha.
And I loved reading series as a kid, especially science fiction. So yeah, I think that got in my head, and I still want to write a big series. Yeah. It's going to happen. I don't know what it is, but I was very glad to be gently moved away from that.
Well, it's a lot. It's a lot to take on. I say gently, but that email was like getting shoved off a cliff. Like,
gently shoved off a cliff. Yeah.
Oh, for this series, consider this phrase: "Winter is coming." You use that if you want to.
I mean, I could write a contemporary realism series, and it's just summer is coming because the world is ending. Great.
There you go. Or a little climate fiction. Winter is not coming.
Exactly.
Winter is not coming is my next one.
I have to say that related to your question about did those series get in my head, I think the thing that actually got in my head is a lot of my reviews for Mark Does Stuff, particularly in the early days, were actually narrative nonfiction. I would tell stories about my life in order to relate to the text I was reading. And so when I actually made it contemporary, I found it way easier than I expected. But it took a while for me to realize, like, oh, you've been writing in this style already.
Right.
You just have to.
That's your voice.
It was a whole thing I didn't think I had, but I really did. I just wasn't thinking of it in terms of fiction. So
right.
Wow, you just went home and felt and went with it. That's great.
That's really
so
great.
I'm curious about a specific thing that's in Anger is a Gift, and that is the therapist's Rolodex exercise. That sounds very real to me. I'm wondering if that's something you know of as opposed to invented.
Do you want to tell people about it?
Let's go.
You can explain what it is, first of all.
I was in therapy, and this is about 9 or 10 years ago. And it was from a therapist who was helping me deal with the death of my father. And, so that subtext and a lot of that nuance that's in Anger is a Gift is very real. It comes from grieving someone who's been in your life and then suddenly is not. And
it felt very real.
It was applied slightly differently. But the idea was that, this specific therapist was very aware of the fact that I had depression and anxiety since I was a kid. And one of the ways that manifests is that it is always easier for me to not only just assume the negative, but remember negative thoughts. And so they use this Rolodex metaphor as a way of, you have all of these very positive memories in your head, and I want you to visualize them like a Rolodex in order to remember them, and to think of things that are positive about your father and your relationship with him and these wonderful things that you went through. And it has to be a very conscious thing. And that is, it stuck with me, and I still do it to this day. When I'm starting to dip into the more negative side of my thinking, it's sitting there and being like, no, here is the things I'm going to think about, and I'm going to think about them very consciously and intentionally. And it made its way into the book.
That's really
wow.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
And then you have to explain to people what a Rolodex is now.
Exactly. Exactly.
That has been a weird thing because I didn't think about it. And I will meet kids who are like, I had to Google what a Rolodex is, and I'm like, I want to die. This is the worst thing that's ever happened.
And they're so cool,
Yeah.
Just spin them.
You should bring one.
Like, I wish I had one.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
I have one. I'll send it to you.
She's not using it for anything.
Yeah, right.
She hangs on to the bad thoughts.
I have all my positive thoughts in there, so it's empty.
Yeah, so she's not using it. Yeah, right.
Oh, bless.
So you're in this position where your debut novel is out, and I think I read that you finished your next book and you're working on a couple of more. Number 3 and number 4. I was wondering, one thing that I'm kind of fascinated by is how writers' processes change when they get that first deal on a book that they've had the luxury of spending several years on, and then have to kick butt and write the follow-up. How has that been? How has your process changed, and what can you tell us about the next book?
Right. So I was lucky enough that my agent is a genius. And one of the things he told me right after I signed with him was, do not wait. Write your second book now. Mm-hmm. So I started the research that I needed to do for the second book about a week or two after we signed together. I started writing it in April of 2017 and then finished it in October of that year, actually on Halloween. I was very proud of it.
Yeah.
And that piece of advice has stuck with me, which is don't wait around.
Yeah.
Don't wait for projects to get sold. Don't wait for them to get published. Always move on when you have the time and do other things. So I had finished the first draft, my second book, almost 2 years ago. And so right now, all we have left is line edits on it. It comes out the end of summer next year. But that has helped because it meant that I could move on to other things. I have middle grade projects that I'm working on right now as well because I really want to write for an even younger space. I'm currently also working on the proposal for my third YA for tour, hopefully for Tour Team. And so I don't know that my process has changed. The only thing that's changed is I've just gotten faster, which is a good thing because you're right. You have much less time to get these things done. But I'm very glad that I got that advice early on to not wait around. So when I'm not editing or working on, things that are due immediately, I'm always thinking of the future and planning books, planning out these stories. And I'm always chewing on something in the background as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I think that's really good advice that you got from your agent, because it really is important to be working on something else while you're torturing over what's going to happen with the current.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, but I did want to ask this because it's something that I've kind of bumped into in my own writing. And I'm curious about it. So on your website, on your bio, you go by they as well as he. And I was wondering if you use the they as the singular pronoun in your fiction, and if so, if you have any tips on how to avoid antecedent confusion in passages where there is a possible plural antecedent, because it can get really tricky really fast.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear any thoughts.
It's this is such a great question. Thank you so much for asking this, because I love talking about it from a craft perspective, because usually that question is framed as like, well, who uses they? And I'm like, lots of people. Let's get over that. Let's just skip. But you're right. There are periods where it can actually be very confusing in a sentence. So I have a non-binary character named Bits in my first novel, who is modeled after a lot of my experience with my gender, where I wanted a character to not be gendered in any way at all. Because for me, that's like my ideal state. And right now I'm very comfortable using he and they. But ideally, like if we lived in a world where this just didn't happen and we didn't have to think about that. So one of the things that I recommend that people do, and this is actually just a great general edit as well, is to read them aloud. Read those sentences, because often you can find the fix to reorganize the paragraph or reorganize the subject or the object of a sentence so that you don't actually have that confusion. And so when I had scenes where Bits was in them, I had a friend who I would just say, hey, can you just sit down? I'm going to read these sentences to you. Please let me know if you know who I'm talking about. And 9 times out of 10, they were like, yeah, I don't actually know who that's about. What is going on in the sentence? And it's so helpful, if you don't have someone else, even just, I read all my things aloud to myself at some point, because I think it is a great way, by the way, to write with a sense of rhythm and meter in your prose anyway. But it helps with sentences where you have a bunch of pronouns, and not just they, but any of the pronouns you're using. Read them aloud and see where it feels awkward, because we all have a great instinct for when a sentence feels like garbage, which I tell, like we do, we really do. We write it often. We write a sentence and we're like, that's not good. But saying it aloud, I find it is easier to identify where that sentence falls apart.
How would you fix it if it's confusing and you're using they? how would you fix it?
So there were a few instances where I didn't need to refer to the other characters, and I was looping them into the sentence, and there was really no need to do that. So I found is to focus it, is if this sentence is going to be addressing one person, make sure the stuff around it makes sense that you're only talking about one person. Right. The main confusion comes when you're jumbling perspective and you're jumbling how many players are in any one scene. So I found that just stripping it away and giving it a focus and making sure that sentence was always clear about who they were talking about.
Yeah, making sure the antecedent is clear for the context.
In other words, they either has to be plural or singular. You can't jump back and forth between the two, or you'll drive the reader crazy.
But it has to be plural also.
But in that context,
you don't use
in that one place.
So do you think we need a new pronoun?
Oh, I mean, we have so many neo-pronouns at this point. I think it's a matter of which one of them is going to become more popular and more used. I have a lot of friends who use Z, and it's a strange word to say, but as you say it, because I have friends who use them and I respect their pronouns, it's one of those things where like, oh, I really think a new word is going to be this thing that over time is going to change the way we think about it. And I think part of it is, So, and to speak very on a detailed level, I think part of the problem I had with the thing you're talking about is I had these scenes where like 6 characters were talking with one another. And that's where it gets confusing because you use they, both plural, and then you're talking about a single person. And it made me think, do I actually need all of these characters here? Do I need to actually be... And it was the same advice that I went back to, which what is the focus? Who are you talking about? Do you need every single voice? And often I found, no, I think I'm just making this confusing for the reader, even without thinking of this pronoun. And it made it so that I would force myself to be like, okay, what is the easiest way to convey this information to the reader while I still keep the main character's voice? And I found, I have that pronoun in my next book as well. And I found it so much easier to write it by just drilling down into what does this need to accomplish for the reader.
Right. No, that's great. That's great.
I mean, thank you for that.
One thing that I wonder about, because I do think that definitely we need another like a word that just means Z. And the thing that I wonder about is when we finally, collectively, however it happens, that we decide on what that word is going to be, is the fiction that is written during this time going to be confusing to people, like in the places where they and them has been used singularly, after this new, whatever is adopted, there's going to be this period of time where we've been forced to use the plural as singular.
I don't know. I that's a fascinating cultural thing because I think about how many things, I grew up on like classic science fiction and I'm reading a lot of classic fantasy. And like, it's that thing of where things are not just products of their time, but like these amazing snapshots of what was socially acceptable or what are the conventions of grammar, or even the conventions of spelling and tone and voice. I hope people view it with an open mind and view it with, this is how we talked about ourselves. Right. And I hope they have that sense of like interest and wonder that I do when I read things.
It's fluid is the thing. And we're in the middle of that fluidity, really. So,
language is fluid.
Yeah.
We have to go to the next.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I really appreciate you taking the time to address that. And that leaves us with one last question. And that question, of course, is 2 lies and a truth.
Are you willing to tell us 2 lies and a truth?
Or 2 truths and a lie, however you roll.
I'm going to.
It's up to you.
I came prepared. It's going to be very hard because all of these are incredibly specific.
But are they truths or 2 truths and a lie?
2 truths,
2 truths
and a lie.
Awesome.
Okay.
Truths and a lie.
All right.
Are you ready?
Yes. No, but yes.
Good answer. I got heat exhaustion in the Sonora Desert while doing research for a book.
Nice.
Number 2, Will Smith once held my hand for an extended length of time.
Did he know he was doing it? No, it's okay.
Number Sorry. Number 3, I have touched the Large Hadron Collider.
Oh,
wow. That's cool.
I want that to be true.
I was gonna say,
Yeah, I want that to be true.
I'm going for number 3 because I
What
like
is
it.
it?
That would be the lie.
Two truths
Two
and a
truths
lie.
and a
So
lie.
we're
Oh,
choosing
that's
the
a
lie.
lie.
So 2 truths and a lie.
I think the lie is the desert because I think it was a different
Desert.
desert.
I had
Yeah.
the same
Desert.
thought.
Yeah.
Same thought.
hesitated.
So specific.
Yes.
He hesitated.
I bet you're right. I'm going with Kelly.
Will Smith is specific. It could be Idris Elba held his hand.
Oh,
Oh, quit it, Mary. Anyway, I mean,
That's true. That's true. That is.
Yeah.
so I'll go with
I'm
I'll go with the Will Smith.
I'm going to go with Will Smith too.
I'm going with
What's the
desert.
third thing that he touched?
The Hadron
Hadron
Collider.
Collider.
It's a
We'll
science
explain
thing,
it to
Mary.
you later.
Yeah.
Is that a gender thing?
No. Yes, Mary, it's a gender thing. It's the gender particle. We're looking for it.
Okay.
So we have 3 deserts and 2 Will Smiths.
And a
That's the
Mary.
lie.
And a Mary. So you get a Hail Mary on the
what do we
Hadron
have? What do we have?
Collider.
We have 3 deserts and 2 Will Smiths?
Yep.
Okay, lay it on us.
All of you are wrong.
Goodness.
You never
didn't
touched
touch
the Hadron Collider?
No, I have been to CERN and I looked at it, but you're not allowed in the room unless you're a scientist.
Good job.
Yeah, you did.
I
That
don't
was
think
awesome.
anyone's ever done that.
No, we've been stumped.
You
Yeah.
beat the
Yeah,
Reaper.
yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Wow.
Which
I
is
don't know.
funny. The only reason I hesitated is when I said the name of the desert is because I thought I spelled it wrong in the thing that I wrote.
But I did hear
Good
it.
move. Good
You were
move.
right. You were right. I used to write for the movies part of this website when I was living in LA. It was the same website where I wrote about Twilight. And I went to the premiere of I Am Legend, and surprised, I had never been to I'm sorry, it wasn't a premiere, it was the press screening. I assumed it was a screening. I had a very terrible editor who often did not give me the full information. And after the movie, they're like, okay, now you get to go to your interview with Will Smith. And I didn't know that I had no questions prepared. I was also not emotionally prepared to meet Will Smith. And he is the only human being I've ever met in my entire life who I got speechless, starstruck. And like froze. You know those like press junkets where you're in the like chairs with a bright light with a movie poster behind you? It was one of those. And he walked in the room and I couldn't talk for like 30 seconds. And he reached over and he held my hand and said, we're going to get through this. And he was the nicest, most kind human being you could possibly meet and was like, I can tell this is your first one. Don't be nervous. And he held my hand while we did the question.
That is lovely.
That's
That is
great.
lovely.
Yeah,
My
was
esteem for
incredible.
Will Smith just
He's on my
skyrocketed.
want to have
right.
lunch list,
Yeah.
for sure.
Also, way prettier in person. It was very
Yeah.
Nice
Oh,
skin.
Yeah.
man.
You know, he says the same thing about you.
Oh, no. Let's not do that. Oh, boy.
All right. Well, that was tremendous, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us and for sweating through the technical issues we've had. This has
So
been great.
much fun.
Yeah, this
This
has been great.
Thank
so
you.
much fun.
All right, thanks, Mark.
And the dog is back.
My pants are on fire!
If you enjoy the Liars Club podcast and the other fine shows on Project Entertainment Network, check out the cool stuff for sale at the Project Entertainment Network store or consider supporting Project Entertainment Network on Patreon.com. And as always, many thanks for your continued support.
There Shall Come a podcast like no other. Defenders Dialogue. Marvel Comics' original superhero non-team convenes once again. Comic book writers and authors Brian Keene and Christopher Golden take us back to the 70s and 80s as they discuss Marvel's most dynamic collection of superheroes, Defenders Dialogue with Brian Keene and Christopher Golden. Tuesdays exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.
This has been an exclusive presentation of the Project Entertainment Network.